Last time we were discussing the concept of Milchamas Gog and Magog, and we've been going through the sequence of various different phases of the Geula itself, and we've reached a stage basically when the Mashiach ben Yosef is quite well established, and that he's achieved a certain madrega, and that Klal Yisrael, the Jews, have also achieved a certain madrega. And we've said that essentially the madrega they've achieved is a very powerful new awareness or consciousness of the existence of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and a much greater awareness of the nature of providence, of the Hashgacha. And as we said last time, the Geula takes place on two different axes. The Geula takes place to the Mashiach himself, and the Geula takes place to Klal Yisrael. Each one undergoes specific Geula processes, and they're very much interconnected. But the first main Geula goes to the Mashiach himself, and then from there it spills over to Klal Yisrael. And we've gone into that into length, so we're not going to really go back to that now. But we mentioned, and this is what we're up to now, is what is the reaction of the world suddenly to the appearance of a Mashiach in the midst of Klal Yisrael. And this is what we're really dealing with. And we mentioned last week a little bit of what that was. It in essence revolves around the basic nature of Kedusha and Tumah. And just to review just very slightly, Tumah cannot survive alone. The power of the Yetzer Hara, the power of Tumah cannot survive alone. It requires the power of Kedusha to nourish it. And a Geula, in essence, is the removal of the Kedusha from a Tumah. Golus is the acquisition of Kedusha by Tumah. That's in essence what Golus is. So when Kedusha goes to a place where its power and its enormous beauty is in a certain sense given over to the Koyach of Tumah, and we see this all over in the world, that's Golus, when it is in a place that we cannot, when it does not belong. Geula represents the opposite process. And as we've said, essentially what's happening the entire time is that the Shekhinah is being pulled out of its Golus. What the expression is, Shechinta b'Galusa, the Shekhinah is in Golus, it's being pulled out of the Golus, the Kripa, that it's been buried in for thousands of years. When the process starts, there are two steps. The first step is the separation of Kedusha from Tumah. The first step is the separation of Kedusha from Tumah. The second step is the annihilation of the Tumah itself. And the prototype for this, like we said last time, was the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. And this is exactly what happened. It wasn't enough that Klal Yisrael was taken out of Egypt. Egypt represents the full power of the Tumah in the world. And Tumah, of course, is the essential result of Chatoim, sins. In Egypt, the power of Egypt was really the power of the Chatoim of the world invested in that one nation. It was essentially the task of the Jews to go into Egypt and to retrieve the lost Kedusha as a result of different Chatoim from the time of Adam Rishon until that point in time. They retrieved that, and once they retrieved it, the moment that the retrieval was completed, the Rebbeinu Shalom told them, go out. And it's an interesting thing the way he said, go out. B'chatzois hayom. B'chatzois halayla, at around midnight. And that's interesting. It's an interesting thing because it has to do with the whole nature of Geula. Geula is a very strange kind of process. It happens very suddenly, in many ways. That when it's here, suddenly it looks like it'll never come. When you're in a Golus, it looks like there is no such thing as a Geula. Now that looks like a Geula is actually impossible. But it has a lot of it is a function of time. And what the Rebbeinu Shalom does is through the Hanukkah Sayicha, through various processes, slowly brings the Geula. But when the Geula appears, it happens extremely rapidly. A very powerful rush of events. It's like suddenly a volcanic explosion, one explosion after another, when it actually begins to happen. We find it also that suddenly when it came time for Klal Yisrael to go out of Egypt, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, you've got to go out by midnight. They've been there 210 years. What's the big deal? They gotta go out by midnight. Because that's the whole thing. Once the Kedusha is free, there's not a minute to spare. There's no reason to be an extra minute into a golus when there is no necessity. See, important things, we think that time is a kind of an endless concept, but it's not. Time, essentially, is a symbol of certain basic ruchnistic processes that are going on constantly in the world. And as soon as the ruchnistic process or the objective is reached, instantly the time is changed. It's a very, very important klal, just in general, about the concept of time as it relates to the concept of ruchnius, or avoda, spirituality. Nothing lasts forever, not in this world. And that's the essence of this world. Gamze yavor, everything must come to pass. Everything must come to an end. And why is that? Because the essence of this world has nothing to do with permanence. The essence of this world has to do with achievement or accomplishment, which is essentially a dynamic affair. The essence of growth means that you can go from point A to point B. That's what it means. The essence of growth is opposite the concept of being fixed. To grow means to move, to change. And the time in Olam Hazeh, in this world, constantly symbolizes changes and movements in different directions. Once those changes are made, then instantly something else happens. The time is now occupied with another process. It is only in Olam Haba when suddenly whatever you have achieved becomes fixed or eternal. So therefore the whole nature of time is different in Olam Haba. Totally different. And that's the nature of a geula. Suddenly, you can be in Gullus for a long time, and suddenly there's a geula, and you can't understand how it came or why it's there. But the answer is, the Pasuk says, Hazorim b'dimma b'rini yitzoru, those who sow with tears will harvest with joy. And the answer is because this is the thing that the tzoros itself, while you're in your tzoros, and while you're in your gullus, it looks like nothing is happening. It looks like all you're doing is suffering. And that's the classic mistake. The tzoros itself, and in the choshech, that darkness is not simply the absence of movement or the absence of growth. You see, what it is simply hidden growth. Things are still going on. Things are still moving, except that you cannot see it. So it looks like absolutely nothing is happening. And though suddenly the darkness is gone and the light is here, you realize that that darkness was simply not the cessation of activity, like a dormant period. It wasn't that. That in the darkness itself, there were incredible processes going on, bringing Klal Yisrael to the Geula. And suddenly the light appears. The light looks so startling because of the darkness before it. But the fact of the matter is, the light was being built throughout the darkness. That's why it says in the Shemona Esrei, Matzmiach ken Yeshua. Matzmiach, you say by Semach David. Matzmiach ken Yeshua. The Bonishim brings the Yeshua, allows it to grow. He allows it to grow. Semach, the word Tzmiach, because it applies to plants. And what it tells us is that the Yeshua, the ultimate Geula, grows. But it doesn't grow in light. It grows in darkness. The opposite of plants. So suddenly when the light appears, it's a very startling phenomena, but it's really not, if you understand that the entire movement was always taking place in the darkness. The same thing, when the Jews were in Egypt for 210 years, one would never believe that they would get out. It would be absolutely impossible. Until suddenly the time came, and then the Baruch Hashem said to Moshe, now go take them out. Suddenly. Moshe just turned around, and suddenly the Geula started. In any sense, once the Geula does start, the essence of the Geula is the removal of Kedusha from Tumah. That's its essence. That represents the Geula, but that's not a final Geula, because as long as the Tumah is around, it wants the Kedusha back, because it needs to survive. And it immediately, intuitively senses the loss of power, the loss of its energy. So what it does is, like anyone else, wants to survive. It runs after the Kedusha that it lost. Egypt, which represents essentially the power of this tumah, of all the sins of mankind up to that time, as soon as they lost the Jews, they realized that some enormous source of energy is gone. So instinctively they all said, what's happening here? We feel that we've been bereft of our power. Suddenly they ran after the Jews. That's why they ran after the Jews. They ran after the Jews to retrieve the Kedusha, which somehow they felt was what gave them the Hatzlacha to begin with. And they realized that without their Kedusha, they're lost. So they had to run after the Jews, and that's what happened by Kriyas Yamsuf. They ran after the Jews, and the Jews didn't understand it essentially at that point, what was really going on. But that was the final aspect of the Gula. When the Egyptians were destroyed in the Yamsuf, when they were destroyed in the sea, then the Jews sung the Shira. That's when they suddenly sung the song of deliverance. Because that's when the true Gula took place. Because Gula is two steps. It's when you see not only the separation of Kedusha and Tumah, but also the annihilation of Tumah, so that there's no possibility of going back. That's what the Jews realized after Yamsuf. The Egyptians were dead. What that means is there's no possibility of going back into that environment anymore. The Tumah is gone. And that's the true Gula. It's the same thing which will happen ultimately in the future. The Chometz Gog and Magog. It is the exact same thing as well. When the Mashiach arrives, the Mashiach ben Yosef, that is, because we're talking about the key messianic figure who brings the Gula. The Mashiach ben David is not particularly involved with the Gula as such, directly, only later on. But the Mashiach ben Yosef, who's involved with the Gula, and when he begins this process, and Klal Yisrael is now in a situation when they're literally freed from the nations of the world, and we spoke last time how the Mashiach ben Yosef, in a certain sense, will free the Jews from the nations of the world. Suddenly, there's an enormous feeling by certain key nations in the world that something is missing and something is gone. What it is, it's an awareness that the end is near. That's what happens. Tumah suddenly realizes that the end is near. It's almost over. So what happens is, certain key nations in the Goyim, which ones are not clearly identifiable, certain key nations in the Goyim begin to rebel against the Mashiach and wage war. And it's an enormous fight. But it's literally a fight to the end. It's a fight, it's the last war of the world. It is the last conflict between the Kedusha and the Tumah, which exists in Olam Haba, in all actuality. And that's what the enormous fight is about. Now, the Medrash is very interesting at this point here, and it's very mysterious. But in essence, it has also to do with the Mechomes Gog and Magog has to do with certain key people, key individuals, and the key group that is involved in it is the Erev Rav, which means that there will be a whole bunch of Jews who will join the Goyim. Yes, the last war of the Mashiach against the Goyim includes many Jews who will go to the side of the Goyim. Those Jews who we've spoken to are the Erev Rav. Those are the Jews who are descendants from the Jews the Egyptians who converted. And as I mentioned before, because of the fact that they caused Israel to sin with the Chet of the Egel, because of the fact that they caused Israel to sin with the Chet of the Egel, they became the last klipa or vessel that would attempt to destroy the Jews. Which means that there are Jews whose sole job and sole simcha is to be choytem machtas harabim. Not only to sin themselves, but to see to it that no other Jew keeps the Torah. That's the most distinguishing characteristic of an Erev Rav. You see, it is a Jew who not only hates everything about the Torah, but lives to see to it that nobody else keeps it as well. And if you really look at Erev Rav, you can see the Reform, the Conservative, many of these things, many Zionistic elements, secular Zionistic elements, people who are such Soni Yisrael that the only simcha they live for is to destroy any ounce of Kedusha. These Jews are really part and parcel of an Erev Rav. And that Erev Rav is the last enemy of the Jews, as I've mentioned before in the Golus itself. The last enemy of the Jews is not Esav, it's the Erev Rav. And that what happens is a vestige of that Erev Rav remains in Mechomes Gog and Magog. And the key man in that Erev Rav, his name is Amalus. And that's what he called in Russia. That's what he called Amalus for Russia. I just like the English here. Amalus. That's what the Medrash calls him. That's his name. Amalus, who is the main individual in the Erev Rav. And it's he who stirs up the Goyim. He actually literally stirs up Esav and Yishmael, elements in Esav and Yishmael, you see, to attempt to destroy the Jews. Because he senses his own weakness. He senses that he is about to die. So with all these elements, they all battle against the Mashiach ben Yosef. And this is a very important point. Very important to realize. The last battle called the Mechomes Gog and Magog is not a war between America and Russia, as many people think, or this and that and so on. That's not what it's about. It has nothing to do with a war of Goyim against Goyim. It is not Goyim against Goyim. Like everyone, a lot of people think that in the end, American Russia, the bear and the eagle, I don't know, these stories that come down and what the stories are going to do. There's nothing to do with anything. That's not what it's about. The last war has to do between the Mashiach and the nations of the world. Just like it had to do with Paro and Moshe, you see. And it's the attempt of the nations of the world to recapture their glory, because they are all about to die. The dominion or the dominance of the Goyim is about to end, and the ascension of the Jews is about to begin. And the Goyim sense this. No longer like in the last 5,000 years of history or whatever have you. They have been the dominant peoples. They have run the world. The world essentially belongs to the Goyim, the Ummah Olam. It's not the case. And they know that, and they fight the Mashiach against that concept. Now, as I mentioned last time, there are two possible scenarios or outcomes to that war. There's the original outcome, and there's the current outcome. And I mentioned this last time. Originally, what the Gemara says is that in that war, the Mashiach ben Yosef loses and dies at the hands of Amalek. Which means that after the Mashiach redeems all the Jews and brings them back to the land of Israel, they are all re-exiled again. It's an incredible thing. Now, I don't mean that the Mashiach ben Yosef, who does that, is a false Mashiach. He is an absolutely real Mashiach, with all the powers of a Mashiach. This is no false Mashiach. But in spite of that, he loses. And we went into the concept of why he loses, because of the notions of what happened to the 10 tribes and Yerovim ben Nevat, which I'm not going to go into. It's a kapara, an atonement of what happened a long time ago. Now, that decree, which the Gemara Sukkah says, that the Mashiach ben Yosef dies, there are many different types of deaths. But that ultimate death is not what will happen. But what you have is a lot of Kabbalahs in the Vilna Gaon. One of the most famous was mentioned, and I've seen it in the Sochachov and a number of different places, and even my Kohen Tzadikim, that the Gezerah of this, the fact that the Mashiach will lose, so that the Geula will be reversed again, has been removed for two basic reasons. One, because of Moshe Rabbeinu, and whether you know it or not, Moshe Rabbeinu died. When he died, he was buried where? He wasn't buried in Israel. He was buried outside of Israel, which means that the neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu has no menucha at all. Menucha means no rest or tranquility, because the Baruch Hashem said that I need you as the atonement for Klal Yisrael. I need you to suffer in certain ways, in a spiritual way, and that will allow the Jews to survive until the true Yemos of Mashiach comes, the true Messianic period. Because the Messianic period was supposed to come with you. You are the Mashiach ben Yosef, and it should have come with you. The Erev Rav at your time caused the Jews to sin in terms of the Chet of the Egel, the golden calf. You therefore must assist in the atonement of Klal Yisrael itself. That's why the Baruch Hashem said, and that's a very important thing, Moshe begged the Baruch Hashem to go into the land of Israel. And the Baruch Hashem says, you cannot. Now we know the story of why Moshe cannot go in, because of what happened by the rock. Instead of talking to it, he hit the stone, and the Baruch Hashem said that this was a poor demonstration of faith. That the question is, because of the fact, everything that Moshe did all his life, because he didn't speak to the rock and he hit it, that means he what? He couldn't go into Israel? That's not what it was. Obviously, that chait was only the excuse, so to speak, of the Chit Makatrik, the Satan, to deny Moshe as Israel, but that's not what it was about at all. What Moshe was saying to the Baruch Hashem was, is there no other way to get into a Geula? When Moshe was begging to go into the land of Israel, Moshe was begging the Baruch Hashem to bring the Yemos of Mashiach. It was the same thing, in essence. Just like when David HaMelech wanted to build the Beit HaMikdash, he was begging the Baruch Hashem that the Yemos of Mashiach should start then. Because if David HaMelech had built the Beit HaMikdash, it could never have been destroyed. And if Moshe had gone into the land of Israel, they would never have been exiled. Because these were both the classic Mashiachim themselves, which means that if they would have succeeded in doing what they should have done, it could not have been reversed. And the Baruch Hashem said it cannot be. It cannot be. You see, you cannot go into the land of Israel because the Jews are not worthy of the Messianic period. This period must take place in the future. And you are the person, you are my instrument to ensure that this takes place in the future. So Moshe was buried. Not only he refused to go into Israel, he was never buried in Israel. He was buried in the Chutzlaos, in the outside, in the land of the Goyim, which is a Talmudic land, which symbolizes that the neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu is deep, deep in the Tumah. You see, the only other neshamas in the Tumah, along with Moshe, stretched along in the same way, is the neshama of the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David. They're all stretched along, and each one is an atonement for a different aspect. The second thing which prevents the Mashiach ben Yosef from dying at this point is the length of the Gullus. There's a reason why the Jews are in Gullus for 2,000 years. And the 2,000-year period that we have suffered is essentially to remove any possibility of that Geula, the redemption, from reversing itself. Now you may say, what do we have to do with what happened before? All the neshamas of the Jews today are in some way connected to those Jews who sinned at that time and who damaged a certain part of the Geula process at that point. So it is destined for those people to come back, experience the Geula, and then be re-exiled. But what the Bnei Shalom did was instead put them through a Gullus of 2,000 years, so that they all undo that damage slowly, so that when the Geula finally does come, it will not be reversible. It's only approximately 2,000. That means since the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Doesn't mean exactly. It means, since the destruction of the first temple, it's over 1,900 years, so I'm just using that figure, but it means the full length of the Gullus itself. The question that's asked, which is a very good one, is again, just like we've discussed before, about the process or the way the Mashiach ben Yosef will redeem the Jews from the land of the Goyim through the 10 plagues with Chochmah, not with Nisim. But the 10 plagues will be repeated with Das, with Chochmah. You see, the question is, how will the Mashiach ben Yosef fight the Muhammad Gog and Magog? And that's a very fascinating question, and the truth is I really am not clear about that. But it's a very difficult one, exactly. I would imagine that it will be a similar type of thing. These wars are not physical. That's a mistake. Most people think that these are nuclear wars. These are not physical wars as such. These are spiritual wars, really. The war between Moshe and Paro was not a physical one. Paro didn't raise up a Jewish army to rebel against Egypt. Moshe didn't raise up a Jewish army to rebel against Egypt. Not at all. Moshe simply said, the time is for the Jews to go out now, and there's nothing you can do about it, and I'm going to prove it to you in the next 10 sessions. And that's in essence what it was. It's the same thing over here. Mashiach ben Yosef comes to the nations of the world and says it is time for the Jews to leave. You see, all the Kedusha that you used to have is no longer theirs. We have it back. We have no place with you, and you have no power to hold us. And I'm about to prove it in 10 different ways. That's in essence what it is. Now this is something else. You see, this kind of war probably is, and I can give you the basic idea of it, but the depth of it is difficult. The war of Gog and Magog is probably very similar to Kriyas Yamsuf, because that's its identical counterpart in the first Geula. You see, Kriyas Yamsuf is the end of the Paro. Muhammad Gog and Magog is the end of the Ummah Olam, the end of Esav. That's it. It's all over from then on. So this war is similar in certain ways to what? To Kriyas Yamsuf. And one would have to think about exactly what the similarities were and so on. One could do that, but that suffice to say that it is not a physical war. These are spiritual wars. These are battles of Chochmah. You see, battles of power that relates to understanding the world in terms of who can attract different people through different types of information. You see, in a certain sense, it's a different kind of Muhammad. And in that kind of battle, it's very difficult to beat the Mashiach ben Yosef, who is the supreme, vessel for just about all the chokhmah that lies in this world. The essential point is that nothing's really mentioned about these things, really. The true nature of these things is nowhere written. That's a big problem to really understand these things. It really is. Exactly how Muhammad's Gog and Magog is a difficult procedure. Because you have to remember, it's even difficult to understand the first thing of the redemption itself. How does the Mashiach ben Yosef come and redeem all of the Jews? That itself is a very big question. How does a man get up and say, well, I want all the Jews to leave Russia, and this country, that country, and suddenly every Jew leaves, and all the Goyim just sit by and just watch it. What happens? Look what Moshe had to do to get the Jews out of Egypt. But that is not Muhammad's Gog and Magog. Muhammad's Gog and Magog is something else. Muhammad's Gog and Magog is after the presence and leadership of Mashiach ben Yosef already exists, and Klal Yisrael is already following him. You see, and the Goyim realize it. You see, you have to understand the point here. Why are the Goyim getting so upgrade? Why are they getting all heated up? What's the problem? What's going on? What's going on is that suddenly the Goyim realize, wait a minute, all the Jews are leaving, and there's a character out there who is incredible in his power. They suddenly see Kedusha in front of them. They see the face of Kedusha, and that's incredibly frightening to the nations of the world. The famous medrash about that is that the famous medrash, the Satan once went up to the Rebbeinu Shalom, and he said to the Rebbeinu Shalom, the medrash says that the Satan once went up to the Rebbeinu Shalom and said, this light, what is that light that you have behind your throne, underneath your throne? What is that light? So the Rebbeinu Shalom said, this is the light of the Mashiach. That's what he said. So he said, what is his name? He said, the Rebbeinu Shalom said his name is Ephraim. That's Mashiach ben Yosef. And then the Satan says, can I see that? Can I see that? You know? So the Rebbeinu Shalom revealed that light to the Satan, and it says there that as soon as the Satan saw that light, he shook, he trembled. He trembled, and all the nations, the Malachim of all the nations of the world, trembled with him when they saw that light. Why? Because when they saw that light, they knew that was their death. They saw that light was the antidote to their dominion, and they knew that when that light comes down on the world, it is over. It is over with the power of the Ummah and the power of the Goyim. And that's essentially what's involved. Mashiach ben Yosef has that light. Now, if the Mashiach ben Yosef is supposed to die, according to the original Gezerah, that light in some way obviously becomes dark again to some way, so that suddenly the power, the das, or the knowledge of the Goyim become greater. But if the Mashiach ben Yosef is not supposed to die, then clearly that light doesn't. Now, why should that light get dark or not? That has to do with the reason why the Mashiach ben Yosef should have died. The reason why the Mashiach ben Yosef was supposed to die is because there was something wrong with the Jewish people at that time. They're not worthy of a Gula yet. That means that when the light comes down to the Mashiach ben Yosef, and this is really what it's about, the ability of the nations of the world to win over the Mashiach ben Yosef really depends on what kind of light comes down to Mashiach ben Yosef beforehand. That's what it is. If the Mashiach ben Yosef receives a light which is defective in some way, he will then not have the full power to win the war against the nations of the world. But if the light that comes down is perfect, you see, so that his awareness is perfect and his wisdom is perfect, then there's no one that can stand up against him. And whether that light comes down perfect or not depends on whether or not there was a kapara, some sort of an atonement, and the 2,000 years of Golus and Yeshua of Moshe Benu has completely perfected that light, so that when it does come down to Mashiach ben Yosef and the Gula does start, there is nothing in heaven and earth that can stop it. You see, there is not a kitrug or anything that can stop it, and that is the last kitrug. The Goyim realize suddenly that they're losing, and the Satan realizes that he's losing. So the Satan runs up to the Rebbeinu Shalom for the last time. That's really what it's about. What is Milchemes Gog and Magog, the war of Gog and Magog? In essence, it's not a war really against the Goyim and the Jews, although that's what it appears to be. It is deeper than that. Much deeper than that. It is the last attempt of the Midas Hadin, the attribute of justice, to claim in front of the Rebbeinu Shalom that the Jews are not worthy of a redemption. It is the war between the Midas Hadin trying to scrap up some kind of default in the Jews and saying that the Gula should not transpire, the Jews are not worthy. And that's what it is. The same thing by Kriya Samsaf, where the Satan ran up in front of the Rebbeinu Shalom and said the Jews should not be redeemed. The Jews were over the Avodah, they were idol worshippers, and the Egyptians were idol worshippers, let them all be destroyed. The last attempt of that is the Milchemes Gog and Magog, which means that not only do the nations of the world lose, not only does the Satan lose, but the Kitrug loses. The accusation against Klal Yisrael loses, and the Rebbeinu Shalom decides the Geula is here and it is permanent. And then suddenly we go into the next period called the Malchus Beis David. See, the essence of Gog and Magog has nothing to do with Jews, it has nothing to do with Goyim. The essence of Gog and Magog is the obligation of the Midas Hadin to examine your deeds before you have something good. And that has to do with the original contract that a neshama made with God, that he will build Olam Haba by himself, which is called the Tikkun of Nam Neftufa. That's what it has to do. It has to do with that contract, that we, neshamas, want to build Olam Haba by ourselves. We don't want God to give it to us as a gift. That forces the obligation of the Midas Hadin to examine whether or not, therefore, you can have earned it. So at every step of the way, the Midas Hadin is always saying, well, did they make it or not? Have they arrived or not? So the Midas Hadin is an outgrowth of the demand, you see, to remove the problem of Nam Neftufa. This is essentially what it is. Mechumas Gog and Magog is the worldwide, or the global event that simply reflects that process. And that's essentially what it is. In the time of Paro, when Moshe Rabbeinu came to Paro, and he said, "These my people go," okay? The fact of the matter is, Paro had a free will. Paro could have let the Jews go. He could have done that. He decided not to. Now the question is, if the Paro had decided to let the Jews go, what would have happened to the 10 plagues? We would have had 10 different levels of redemption. We would have had that. But it would not have hurt the Egyptians. They would not have been destroyed. They would not have been 10 plagues. They would have simply been 10 developmental processes, or 10 stages, when we finally reach the ultimate light, you see. But those 10 steps have to occur. They have to occur. The problem is that when those steps are occurring, there is always an examination process. Always. Whenever the Jews come close to a geula or redemption, there is a new examination process. Wait a minute. You know, what are we doing? Do they deserve this new step? And that's essentially what it is. Many, many things can change. The 10 plagues can take many different forms. But what can never change is the concept that Klal Yisrael cannot go into Olam Haba unless they've earned it. You see. That they're entitled to it in some aspect by the Midas Hadin. That has never changed. Now, with the conclusion of the Mechumas Gog and Magog, enters into the period called the Malchus Beis David. Now, what is that period? That is the true beginning of the Yemos Mashiach, or the Messianic time. Everything up to now is not the Yemos Mashiach. Everything up to now is the Geula, or the redemption, starting from the beginning, ending with the war of Gog and Magog. But with the destruction of the Ummah Olam and the nations of the world, they no longer have the power to destroy the Jews or even do anything to them. Now that the destruction of the nations of the world is not only the nations of the world, the destruction of the nations of the world is also the destruction of all alien, foreign ideologies, all the religions of the world, all the isms of the world, atheism and communism and whatever have you, and all religions. Every foreign ideology which is keneged Torah, which is keneged Yichud HaBorei, disappears from the world. That step is only reached after Gog and Magog. Mechumas Gog and Magog, in a certain sense, is the last attempt by the Goyim to cloud over the emes of the Torah and say that there's something greater, something more important, something more powerful. The victory of the Mashiach ben Yosef is the total annihilation of Sheker in the world. So that never again is it possible for another type of ideology to come up and say the Torah is wrong and we are right. There is no competition to the Torah after that. Which means that the Jews now have sovereignty. The Jews are the sovereign nation in the world. Why? Not because they're the strongest nation in the world. Because the Jews have sovereignty, because Emes now has sovereignty. The truth reigns. And when the truth reigns, the Jews reign. And that's really what it is. It's Malchus Hashem. Hashem HaMelucha. You see. And this is the concept. The sovereignty or the power of the Jews only lies in the power of the Torah. But the power of the Torah only lies in the power of Emes. And that's really what it is. When Emes, the battle in the world, is really the battle of truth versus falsity. It's the battle whether or not God is God or man is God. That's the ultimate battle of all civilization and all time. It started out at the beginning with Adam Rishon. When the Nachash went over to Chava, the serpent went over to Chava and said, I want you to eat from the Eitzadat of the law, and he provided the best reason of all. And you will be like God. So the ultimate Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov is, who is God? Who is God? Is God God? Is man God? You see. The bottom line is, who is the Rebbeinu Shalom? Who is God, really? And that's the basic conflict between what's called Gili Yichud and Hester Yichud, the revelation of the unity of God versus its concealment. That's the incredible battle that goes on between the two, you see. As men sin, then they say, God is not God, we are God, we are the power, we are independent. We can do what we want, we don't have to listen to someone else. What happens is Choshech enters the world, darkness enters the world, which begins to corroborate man's view. Or at least he thinks it does. Deceptive forces enter the world that attempt to give man the thinking that, well, maybe he's right, maybe he is the power on earth. The more men sin, the more men sin, the more the Baruch Hashem allows men to deceive themselves. So what the Baruch Hashem does is he begins to hide and withdraw. He withdraws to let men think that they have the power. And that's called Hester Yichudo. The ultimate battle of Gog and Magog is the battle of Yichud Havoy, who is the one. And the final consequence of the war of Gog and Magog is the loss of the Ummah Soilum. It's the loss not of them physically, it is the loss of the power of the ideology, you see. That's gone. And everybody in the world understands simple. The God of the Jews is God. And that's it. There is no other possibility. And then the Pasuk of Yeshaya is fulfilled. Umoro Deus Hashem kamayim liyam b'chasem. And the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God like the waters cover the sea. There is not one suffix of that. Just a doubt in the mind of anyone. The Jews, the Goyim, everyone. It will be clear, crystal clear to everyone about this perfect, powerful, absolute nature of the Baruch Hashem. That then allows the Jews to be the superior nation, because the Jewish nation, the Torah, is the essence of that message. So that's why they are now the highest people of all. They are the highest people of all because they are connected to the highest truth. And it is the truth which dominates at that point. The reason why the Goyim are so strong now, because it falsely dominates. You see, science and technology dominates. Anything that says that God did not make the world dominates. You see, materialism dominates. So as long as these forces dominate, then the Goyim dominate, because they represent the forces. At that point, these forces are gone. There is no more materialism as we know it. There is no more ideologies or atheism or whatever story is. There is none of this anymore. So what dominates is pure truth. Once pure truth dominates, then the Jews are now at the top. Once they're at the top, then it's simply a question now of what? Of manifesting or expressing that top, what? Through Malchus. Enter the Mashiach ben David, who is nothing more than a king. But the Mashiach ben David fundamentally, who is a descendant of David, of David HaMelech, is nothing more than what? He's an individual who simply says, I am the king of truth. I am the king now who comes to a nation who is now totally basked in the light of truth. You see, and I'm the king of truth. So the power of the Mashiach ben David is only the power of Emes. And as long as there is no Emes in the world, there is no Mashiach ben David. The power of the Mashiach ben Yosef is the power to take the Emes from the Sheker. That's the Mashiach ben Yosef. He is the one who transforms Sheker to Emes. That's the essence of Geula. He takes the Kedusha of the Tumah. So now Emes reigns. But the Mashiach ben Yosef himself has nothing to do with the sovereignty of Emes. Simply with the transformation of Emes from Sheker, Tahara. The Mashiach ben David, the Davidic Mashiach, he has to do with the sovereignty, you see, of Emes. So he rules. You see. So let's not think in terms of Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David. It's what they do that's critical. And it's what they do that makes them be what they are. The question that's asked is, once the Mashiach ben David arrives, does everyone become Jewish? Well, it depends on what you consider Jewish. What happens is that everyone has the Hasaga of a Jew. And the Hasaga of a Jew is nothing more than Einoid Mavadoi. There's only God. That's all. God is God, and that's it. Hashem Wulakim. That's the Hasaga of a Jew. But what the Goyim do not have is the power of a Jew. Because the essence of a Jew is the ability to elevate the physical world into a spiritual. To go from Olam Hazeh to Olam Haba. Zichoch. Zichur, or the power to transform physical substance into spiritual substance, only resides within the neshama of a Jew, not the neshama of a Goy. So the Goyim will understand the hasaga that the Jew teaches him, but he will never, you see, develop that power which only a Jew has. You see, the Muhammad's Gog and Magog is not a test. like the Chet of the Egel. The Chet of the Egel, the calf, was a test. The Muhammad Gog and Magog, the last war, Gog and Magog, is not a test at all. It is a phase in the Geula. It has to happen. It will happen. And it's very important to understand something about the Yemot Mashiach, which is very different. Until the case itself, until the time when the Baruch Shalom says that He will redeem the Jews, no matter what happens, the Jews have to earn the Geula. They have to earn the redemption through their ma'asim, through their mitzvahs. If they do the mitzvahs, then they can be redeemed. If not, they will not be redeemed. But when it comes time towards the end, when the Jews have to be redeemed, what the Baruch Shalom said was that I will create a situation where the Jews will be redeemed and there will no longer be any tests. Now you may say, well, how does that work? Obviously what will happen, and this is very critical, is that the Baruch Shalom will change His hanhagas, His hashgacha will change. And this is a very important thing. I think I've said it many times before, is that the Baruch Shalom conducts the world in certain ways. You see, the Baruch Shalom is a God of justice and He's also a God of mercy. Now at the outset, when the Baruch Shalom first created the world, He was only a God of justice. And He said to Adam Rishon, if you want to bring Olam Haba, you must do the mitzvah. The manifestation of mercy did not exist yet, because Adam didn't need it. So God was a pure God of justice. The possibility of mercy was created, but it was not manifest until Adam sinned, and then suddenly the Midas HaRachamim, or the aspect of mercy, was activated. When it was activated, does that mean that suddenly the Baruch Shalom became merciful in a total sense? No. What it means is that the Baruch Shalom exhibited a certain type of Rachmanis, which is appropriate at that time. As generations go on and on, the way God is merciful changes. He is not merciful the same way He is later than He is before. For example, in the time of Noah, the people had the flood. When they all sinned, what did God do? He killed them all. Didn't He? But in the Tower of Babel, He didn't kill them all. He didn't kill them all when they didn't want the Torah by Moshe. Which means that the way the Baruch Shalom was merciful in the time of Noah was different than the way He is merciful later. That shows you a very important thing, that the way the Baruch Shalom conducts these midas or the anhagas changes over time, and is essentially dependent or is a function of the kind of chatoim we do. You see. Now, what the Baruch Shalom says is that over time, I will become more and more merciful, and less just, in the sense of being insistent on pure justice. When it comes a time when the Mashiach is supposed to come, or the last period of time, what the Baruch Shalom says is that there will come a time that I will not allow the failure of the Messianic period. I will not allow that failure. Now, how is that possible? How can the Baruch Shalom guarantee such a thing? That has to do with a new type of hanhaga that has never existed before at all. I mentioned before that when Moshe Rabbeinu prayed to God not to destroy the Jews when they worshipped the golden calf, you remember I mentioned that Moshe Rabbeinu convinced God to do something He never did before. A new thing that the Baruch Shalom never did before. He forced in its kaviyachol the Baruch Shalom to change his hanhagas, or he prayed for the hanhagas, you see, to change the way he relates to the Jews. And as I mentioned, what he did was, when the Jews received the Torah the first time, that Torah was supposed to be the light of the Mashiach. And when the Jews worshipped the calf, they were supposed to be annihilated. But what Moshe convinced the Baruch Shalom to do was to take the light of the Mashiach and bring it down in Tumah. You see, in other words, let the light of the Mashiach exist even in a world where there is no Messianic period. That's why the light of the Mashiach does not exist in heaven; it exists on earth. But Moshe Rabbeinu convinced the Baruch Shalom to let the light of the Mashiach come down and not take it back. That's the Shivra Luchas, or the broken Luchas tablets. But in doing that, Moshe Rabbeinu convinced the Baruch Shalom to introduce a new type of hashgacha, or a new type of providence that had never appeared in the world at that time. When the Baruch Shalom told Avram that your children will inherit Eretz Yisrael, and Avram said, "B'ma'ita, how do I know?" The Baruch Shalom says, because I'm going to reveal to you a new kind of providence which will allow that type of possibility. He said to Avram, you're right. According to the way that I've guided the world until now, there is no such guarantee. Because as I told the nations of the world sin, and I took away the ability to create Olam Haba from them, I can also do it from you too if your children sin. But the Baruch Shalom says, I will guarantee it to you what I never guaranteed before. The Baruch Shalom did not guarantee to Adam or to Noach that they would definitely inherit the land of Israel. He guaranteed to Avram because the Baruch Shalom says, I am changing the way my providence to allow that possibility. In the time of Muhammad Gog and Magog, there will be no regression back, you see, to a period where there's no Yemos Mashiach. Because Klal Yisrael will not be tested. Because the Hashgacha, or the providence of the world, will no longer require that. What that Hashgacha is a very, very deep thing. The nature of that kind of Hashgacha is a very, very deep, mysterious thing. But there is a different Hashgacha at that point. That's why there is no going back. There is no going back. Once the Mashiach ben Yosef appears and it begins to move, there is no going back. It goes like a locomotive, just moves straight ahead, and there's nothing that can stop it. Nothing. Now the Malchus Beis David, or the Mashiach ben David, as I've said, appears because he is the reflection of a new time. The time of truth, when truth is clearly revealed to everyone. He comes on the scene because he, in essence, represents that. That's what Malchus Beis David represents. Until that truth is manifest, he cannot appear. And until the time that the truth can be wrested from falsity, the Mashiach ben Yosef cannot appear. The Mashiach ben Yosef appears just at the point in time when truth must now be taken away from sheker, from falsity. Then the Mashiach ben Yosef appears to do the job. And when truth finally appears and has to grow purely truth itself, then the Mashiach ben David appears. And that's the second thing we have to go into. What is the purpose of the Mashiach ben David? What is he really going to do? The point is this, you see, the reason why it's very difficult to understand what will happen at that time is because we are dealing with an element which has never existed since the beginning of creation. You know what that element is? What is that element? There is an element which exists at that time which has never existed since the beginning of creation. We've never seen this element. And what is that element called? The light of the Mashiach, the Or Shel Mashiach. Nobody has ever seen that light, you see. Nobody even knows its nature. It is such an awesome type of light. When I mean light, I'm not talking about it is such an incredible awareness of emes that kind of perception has never existed since the beginning of time. What does the world do that's suddenly introduced to a whole new way of thinking? And when I mean a new way of thinking, I'm not just simply saying a new way of thinking, a new fancy idea. I'm not even talking about a scientific revolution. It is true that since the 1800s, the world has changed more in the last 200 years than it has changed in the previous 2,000 years. That's the scientific revolution, you see. If you would take someone from the 16th century and he would go back to someone from the 5th century, life would not be that different. But if you take someone now and you go back to the 17th century, there's an awesome difference. I am not even talking about that kind of difference. The difference between now to what that messianic light, look, that level of perception is so incredible. There's almost nothing to compare to it. So therefore, how can we then really understand what the nature of these wars are like, when that is the weapon of choice of the Mashiach ben Yosef himself? How can we understand that? That's the problem. The problem is we do not understand the most important weapon at that time. It's a weapon of emes that has never existed before. It's a way of looking at reality, a way of looking at things which has never existed before. It is a way of looking at the world with total truth. It has never appeared before. So how can we know what's going to go on over there? What kind of battle is going to take place between the Mashiach ben Yosef, who wields that power, and a bunch of goyim who are trying to defy that power? It is unknown. It is a quantum leap, a qualitative leap into a different time, you see. Trying to understand to some degree what's going to happen in Yemos Mashiach is almost in a sense trying to understand a four-dimensional object when we exist in three dimensions. There's a notion of a qualitative leap. This is a critical idea to understand about this, and I've mentioned this many times and I've tried to be somewhat explicit about it. People think when the Mashiach appears, everybody's going to become frum, and everybody's going to sit and learn. What are they going to learn? They can all sit and learn what we learn today. The world's going to become one super base medrash. And everybody's going to essentially do what they do today. They're going to learn the Gemara, they're going to learn the what? The commentaries, the Rishonim, the Achronim, all the standard commentaries and so on. And that's not at all what's going to happen. We will have the Torah, we will have the Talmud. But the nature of what that's going to look like will change forever, because the Mashiach ben Yosef has the key to open up the Torah in such a way to reveal what's called the Torah B'tzuzah Keter. He will show the light which exists inside the Torah, which has never been seen before. Which means that we will not learn like we did. No base medrash will remain intact. in that sense. You will not have the same form on the shelf anymore. It's a totally different process. You see. The difference between that is like somebody sitting and learning, right, to get information, and a Novi having a prophetic revelation. Can you compare the two processes? Can you compare it? Can you compare somebody what? Can you compare someone sitting down and learning a what? A Gemara to Moshe Rabbeinu receiving the Torah from the Rebbeinu Shalom? Can you compare the two processes? Of course not. But that's exactly what will happen when the Mashiach arrives. When the Mashiach arrives, the nature of learning and the nature of truth resembles the power of a prophetic process. With that kind of weaponry, how is it possible to understand what kind of battles will take place? This is the point. And it's very critical to understand this. The Yemot HaMashiach constitutes a qualitative leap into a level of spirituality, a level of awareness and consciousness, which is not known today. And you see it in the Pasuk. The Pasuk says that. Where the Banishim says, U'malas Hashem l'slavamchem, and God will circumcise the hearts. That's a real circumcision there. The Banishim will take off the cloud on every person's mind which doesn't allow him to see the total emes. What you're dealing with is supermen. You're dealing with a new race of men. It says in the Pasuk, Leiv Tov Vorlekem, Ruach Nocha in Chadesh V'Kirbi. God will purify the heart and bring out a new spirit. What does it mean, a new spirit? New spirit means a new way of thinking, a new way of feeling, a new consciousness. These are the battles that will take place, not that far in the future. Strangely enough. But do we understand these battles using our current what? Antique weaponry? For example, what the essence of Mashiach ben Yosef is to transform this truth. You see, to introduce this new consciousness and new way of thinking. But we all know by everything that, by normal events, that whenever we try and grow or do something new, there's resistances. For example, in many ways, if a person wants to exercise, very simple, he starts to exercise, he begins to feel cramps all over his body. Why is he feeling cramps all over his body? Because the body always maintains the status quo. It wants to stay where it is. When you begin to do things, when you begin to drive, when you begin to achieve health, you see, then all the pathological elements which exist at that point defy that new position. And they don't want it, you see. So what happens is you begin to feel pain. But that pain is part of the cleansing process. Every cleansing process and every growing process has pains in it. Because the old structure wants to maintain the status quo. If that's true of exercise, how much more true is it of the Ummah Shalom and Sheker? Sheker is a way of thinking. It's a way of believing. It's a way of feeling. It's an attitude about the world. You see, it exists because there are many, many things about the world which corroborate it. When the emes begins to appear, the sheker begins to what? Hold on even more tightly. You see, more tightly. And it begins to resist the possible change of what? Of emes. And this is a very, very difficult process. Literally. The messianic development is literally like a woman giving birth, in a certain sense. It's like an incredible struggle to get out that fetus. You see. Tremendous struggle going on. There's a battle, a tremendous battle between the spiritual worlds, between the worlds of Tumah and the worlds of Kedusha. Why? It's not a battle between Kedusha and Tumah. It's not that. It's not a battle of Kedusha and Tumah. That's not what's taking place. If you think that's what's taking place, that is an incredible mistake. The battle between either going to Kedusha or going to Tumah was an old battle. That's a battle that has to do with Bechira or Mitzvahs. The battle of the Mashiach ben Yosef is the battle to take Kedusha from Tumah. Because the Kedusha is already embedded in the Tumah. That's the problem. It's not a question of choosing one or the other. It's choosing one from the other. That's why it's so painful, because the essence of the Mashiach ben Yosef is Tahara, or cleansing. He has to take the light of the Mashiach right out of the Tumah, because it's no longer in the Shemayim. The Messianic light is invested in the Tumah. So it's enormously difficult, and as it comes out, the Tumah does everything it can to hold on to it. It resists it. It defies it at every turn. Well, whatever it is, but that's what you're seeing. That's what you see in the Messianic process. The process of Geula is an extremely strenuous and painful one. The life of the Mashiach ben Yosef is an incredible painful one. Because he symbolizes what? Not two different forces, but one force swallowing another. He symbolizes the existence of two forces existing or coexisting at the same time, where one dominates the other. You see, it's an enormously painful type of experience. The Mashiach ben David gets off light when it comes to that. In a sense, I mean, his neshama is also on the tremendous things, but there's a certain lightness about that. It is Yosef that went into Mitzrayim, not Yehuda. Yehuda stood with his father and learned the Beis Medrash. You see, Yosef was the one that was sold by his brothers. Yosef was the one that went to Mitzrayim. Yosef was the one that was thrown in the pit and sold to Potiphar. Yosef was the one that was in Mitzrayim with not a Jew around. It is Yosef the one that had to survive, because Yosef was in the Tumah, and in the Tumah, Yosef had to be Yosef. That's why Yosef is called Yosef HaTzadik, a real tzaddik. Yehuda is not, because the job of Yehuda is lighter. Let's just finally discuss a little bit about the Mashiach ben David, and then we'll stop. What does the Mashiach ben David do? Well, the Mashiach ben David has nothing to do with transformations, does he? He comes in a fait accompli. It's here. You know, it's here basically. Although the Mashiach ben David is said to, in some way, and I have to correct myself, the Mashiach ben David essentially is involved to some degree on the transformation process. He is. And you see that in the Pasuk, because it says, V'olu Moshim Ba'Sion Lishpoit es ha'esav. It says, V'olu Moshim, and there will arise saviors, plural, Ba'Sion, on the mountain of Zion, Lishpoit es ha'esav, to judge the mountain of Esav. So you see that the Mashiach ben David is also involved to some degree in the process of Tahara, you see, because of the plural Moshim. But that's not his main function. The main function of the Mashiach ben David is to reign, you see, in a world which is essentially already lit. The Mashiach ben Yosef's job is mainly to light the world. That's essentially what it is. Now once the world is lit, what does the Mashiach ben Yosef do? He makes the light stronger. He makes the light so strong, so powerful, that Olam Hazeh, this world could no longer exist. And that's what he does. He takes Olam Hazeh out of its skin. It's like he sheds. He allows the light to become so strong. He brings the Jews up to such a madrega. He initiates new forms of Kedusha in such ways that suddenly the Kedusha becomes so powerful that not only is Tumah gone, which was gone before, but more than that, Chulin is gone. Just simple materialism is gone. And what happens is the world sheds its skin. And as it sheds its skin, it becomes Olam Haba. The Mashiach ben David controls the shedding process. And the way he does it is that he enlarges the Kedusha. He brings Kedusha down. He enlarges Kedusha. He is not involved in the acquisition or the retrieval of Kedusha from Tumah. He is involved primarily with the strengthening or the enlargement of Kedusha itself, so that it's so powerful, the next step is Olam Haba, or a spiritual world. His job is to destroy the physical universe itself. And that's what he does. Through his leadership and through his sovereignty, he brings the Jews to Madrega, where they begin to slowly enter into the period of Olam Haba. Now there are a number of steps there that we have to discuss before that, and we will have to do that, but the question is, what is the Mashiach ben Yosef doing at this period of time? That's the question, you see. Does his job end? And the answer is it does not. But in order to explain that on a deeper level, we have to go further down towards Olam Haba to understand a very great mystery in the Torah. And what the Rebbeinu Shem says, I have two people, the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David. They are like one branch in my hand. You see, the Rebbeinu Shem says they are integrally connected. And they shall be in my hands as one, so that the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David both emanate from the concept of Mashiach. You see, and both are connected to each other, which means that you cannot have a Mashiach ben David without a Mashiach ben Yosef, and you cannot have a Mashiach ben Yosef without a Mashiach ben David. But more fundamentally, the reason why the Mashiach ben Yosef was made was so that the Mashiach ben David could survive. And the Mashiach ben Yosef does not disappear until the Mashiach ben David disappears. Because the Mashiach ben David cannot live without the Mashiach ben Yosef. It is impossible. I will explain that at a different time. There's a very deep mystery in the twinning concept of the two, what's called the Trei Mashiachim, in Aramaic, or the two Mashiachs, We will continue with this next time.